Hi, I'm Clark on Temptress. This is a lithium iron phosphate battery. This is an alternator. I've said, and I'm sure you've seen other places, these two don't get along very well. In this video, we're going to talk about how they don't get along, why they don't get along, and how to address it in your installation. We have a Patreon page, and it allows people to ask me questions. One of the questions I get asked the most is just this. I'm going to put lithium iron phosphate on my boat. What about my alternator, Clark? How do I deal with that? This video, we're going to go into that. We're going to answer that question, partly because everybody needs to know the answer, and partly because I'm tired of typing the answer. So, this is going to be everything I know about alternators and lithium iron phosphate and how to make them work together. Lithium iron phosphate is great. If you switch to it, your life will get better. It has two inherent differences than the lead that it might have replaced. One is it has a BMS inside it. That's an electronic device that protects the very delicate lithium iron phosphate cells from what can happen to them on the outside. And how it protects them, if you go outside of the safe zone, is it just shuts the battery off. The other thing is these guys can pull power in really fast. If you had lead for a while, you know once you get the lead above 80% charge, it takes forever to get it to 100%. The voltage would just go up, so all the charge controllers have to lower the voltage, which means lower the current, which means feed them slowly, like with a little baby spoon. These guys can just gulp it down until they're full. And that's an inherent difference too that affects alternators. This is an alternator. This one came original equipment with my Yanmar engine. It's a Hitachi. It's probably something that many of you have on your boat. If you don't have this one, they're all really very much the same thing. This alternator is a power producing device, and power is voltage times amps. So when it's doing its job, there's an amp flow going through the system, going into the batteries. This thing is putting it out with the push of the voltage required to get it to move. If you suddenly disconnect its load, you suddenly turn off its battery, this guy will stop being able to push amps because there's no path anymore. And what happens with that same power is the voltage skies right up to infinity, or at least it attempts to. On its way to infinity, it crosses 100 volts DC, which destroys the diodes in the alternator, like that. And that is bad, because now the alternator is non-functional until you replace those diodes. But it gets worse, because that is not completely instantaneous. It's like 400 milliseconds. And in those 400 milliseconds, your entire charging system, your entire load system, all your power panels just got exposed to maybe 100 volts DC. I don't know if that new chart plotter you have can handle that. So we've got kind of a two-pronged problem here. When the battery goes away, the voltage skies, destroying the alternator, certainly, but very likely doing some other damage. I've had more than a few boats come to me while we're out sailing saying, Clark, my alternators aren't putting out power anymore. And I'll look into them. In fact, I got to the point where I just say, you have lithium, don't you? What will happen is they're charging hard, usually with the alternator. The voltage comes up into the high range. If the battery is out of balance, and the cells do get out of balance, that's when one cell is going to be a little too high, the BMS is going to do its job, turn off the battery, and when the battery's off, the alternator's gone. My little story to the last guy I fixed this with, I said, I bet you I know your history. You were motoring along one day some time ago. He had generators and other ways to make power, so he doesn't really rely on his alternators. But you were motoring along, and strangest thing happened. All of a sudden, your whole boat went dark. You lost all electrics, chart plotter, everything just went out. And you're getting very concerned. The engines are running great. And then everything came back. He's, Clark, how did you know that? I said, well, you were motoring along. Your alternator raised the voltage. Your BMS shut down. Your alternators were destroyed. So you've got no battery power because the BMS is down. You've got no alternator power because the diodes have burned out. What's the next thing that happens? Black boat. But within a minute or so, the BMS kind of reconnects as the voltages in the cells just naturally come down, and you work it again. Well, he anchored somewhere, solar panels, generators. It was months before he even realized his engines weren't producing power. That's the number one problem. So how can we solve that problem? How can we keep it from happening? Well, the easiest way, the classic way, the way they would have done it in 1970 is do not disconnect the battery from the alternator ever. Well, it's not an option with lithium because that needs to be able to disconnect to protect itself when things go wrong. So what you can do is have lead in your system and have the lead always connected to the alternator. You could do that by having the alternator only charge the starter battery. That would be fine. Have a lead starter battery. But the power from the alternator, you would like to have that in the house batteries because, you know, power is a good thing. You can do that with a DC to DC charger, but I believe they have lots of problems, and if no other reason, they drop like 20%. That's why they have a fan. They make heat because they waste power, and they're limiting in a lot of ways. Another way to do it is to make a hybrid battery system where you connect your lead and your lithium together. And the best way to do that, of course, I make these things, so I talk about them as the best way, but there's nothing else like it, is a BankManager. You put a BankManager in, lead is always connected. It's just how this thing works. Lithium's connected, and you simply can't harm your alternators. Oh, there's another way. This is what the ABYC, I believe, has picked up as the right way right now. Hopefully they'll have a second thought on this. They suggest that you spend a lot of money. Of course, ABYC is kind of funded by the companies that make stuff, so there's that. You change out your BMS to a BMS that has a wire coming out of it that before it disconnects the battery, it sends a signal. That signal is sent to a very special new external alternator regulator you would have to install. And it takes that signal, shuts down the alternator in time before the battery goes away. Well, it would work. It's expensive because you have to basically replace all the electronics that have to do with charging in your boat. And how do you know it works? It's not something you can test very easily. So if the signal were to get destroyed, on the way, if the wire broke or corroded or something, this isn't something that happens daily. This is something that happens once in a blue moon. And when it happens, the downside is complete destruction of the alternator's ability to charge. So I'm not a big fan of that either. Anyway, we've got a video on this, and you can decide yourself if that's the solution. But it is a concrete, absolute solution because a battery is always connected to the alternator. Now, the other problem is these guys can gulp down power real well. They'll just take lots of it. They don't have that automatic requirement of taper, and that's why they're great. It's like your solar panels are larger on your boat because you don't have to do that taper at the end of the day. So you're producing everything the sun can give you all the time. That's great. You can get a lot of power into them from your alternator. That's great. When an alternator makes electricity, the electricity flows through coils within the alternator. I mean, pretty obvious. The circuit is the circuit, and that's part of the circuit. Whenever amperage flows through a resistance, and wire always has some resistance, it makes heat. Like the heater at your house, a resistance heater you'd plug into the wall, or a hairdryer, same thing. So this thing is a device that makes heat, and the heat it makes is proportional to the amount of electricity it produces. Now we can get rid of that heat. It's got a built-in way to do that. It has this fan. Sometimes the fans are outside like this one, sometimes they're inside the case, but alternators always have fans. Fans blow air through, the air can draw the heat away. Thing about fans is the faster you spin them, the more air they blow. And it's not linear. It kind of goes up quite a bit as they go faster. So if you're spinning a fan slowly, you're not really pumping that much air compared to spinning it faster. That'll become important in just a bit. And then the last thing about heat and alternators is the belt. This has a ribbed belt. I've switched to a ribbed belt recently on Temptress, and I'm absolutely happy about it. I put it in a little tips and tricks video. It's mostly about changing the oil on an engine, but I talk about all kinds of things, including this. These belts don't slip as much, and they don't wear as much. I think it's a really great idea because a V-belt not only wears out if you get any corrosion in the system at all, but when it slips, it's friction, and that puts a lot of heat into the alternator as well. So always keep that in mind. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to assume your belt is pristine, but if you have a hot alternator, it could be electrical or it could be friction. Now, alternators. Well, there's all different sizes. This is, I believe, a 55 amp Hitachi. It's what came with the Yanmar. It is kind of a run-of-the-mill, minimal, makes enough power to start the engine again alternator. A lot of people upgrade their alternators, and there are some alternators in the same size case with the same size fan that can put out a lot more power. The mere fact that I have this to show you implies that I've changed out mine, which I have. So I've replaced this 50-ish amp alternator with, I believe it's a 140 amp alternator. It's a lot more heat that it can produce. If you have the original type alternator that's, relatively tame, it's very unlikely it even has the power to get hot enough to overcome its ability to cool, even if it's connected to lithium iron phosphate batteries. If you have these new higher end alternators, they do produce more heat. So they're more prone to this. And this has to be addressed. There's two ways to address this. One would be like operationally, and I'll get into that. And the other one would be actively, having the alternator or the alternator charging system actually monitor the heat of the device and derate itself when necessary. Okay, let's talk about how you would use your alternator. Now, in the best of world for the engine, you would start the engine, get the anchor up, and go. Let the engine do work. Diesels hate to just idle and run for a long time without doing work. Check your owner's manual, particularly the Yanmar. They're very picky about, don't let this engine idle. Make it work. If you're going along moving the yacht, you're at 2,000-ish RPMs. This alternator is spinning very, very fast, and there's a lot of air blowing through it. Typically, again, you won't have an overheating problem. If you're just at regular idle, you just started it up while you're pulling up the anchor, there's very little power coming out of the alternator. So even though there's not a big airflow at that time, it kind of doesn't matter because it's only putting out maybe 20, 40 amps, not the big numbers yet. How people get in trouble with alternators, particularly the high output ones, is you pop the engine into neutral, you watch the amp meter, and you rev up the engine until you see the amps max. If you go any higher, it doesn't put out any more power, and you back up and you go, that's it. I'll charge those batteries in no time, and I don't have to listen to the engine too badly. What you found is the place in the curve where the alternator makes the most heat, because it's making the most power, and still is spinning relatively slowly, so it doesn't have a lot of cooling. So that's hard on alternators. If you're going to do that, in particular, you need to use some kind of an active system to make sure that it's not overheating. But you probably should look into this anyway. In engineering terms, if you have a device that can do its rated power day in, day out, no problem, that's a continuous duty device. And what I'm kind of saying is a lot of marine alternators really aren't continuous duty. So you got to look into that. What's too hot? Well, alternators actually run really hot. A good number for an alternator might be like 100 degrees Celsius. That's the boiling point of water. If you were to touch the case and go, it's hot, because it hurts you, I've always been told in electronics when we're touching chips and trying to figure out if they're hot or not, 60 degrees Celsius is the pain threshold. So this normally runs way over the pain threshold. This is really hot. If you want to check the temperature, these are great. These are those deals where you point at and read the display, and they use the infrared coming back, little camera kind of a deal. And you can tell how hot the alternator is. You could also put a thermometer right on the alternator case, of course, and get a good indication. If your alternator, the way you're going to use it, isn't getting hot, you don't have a problem. I, way before the days of lithium, have always carried a ridiculously high amount of lead batteries. I carry 1,500 amp hours of lead. Now, they're not lithium, but boy, when they were discharged, it would take the alternator full out, hours and hours and hours to recharge them. So I kind of had been living this long before lithium. So you've done your tests, and let's say you've decided my alternator's running too hot. I've got to address this. Or I don't want to be bothered with that watching the RPM thing to only use it in certain envelopes of engine speed. I just want it to take care of itself. I want to just be able to forget about it. How do you do that? Well, probably the most straightforward way is use an external regulated alternator. Grab one of those cool external and expensive regulators like a Balmar that have thermal protection, and buy their option to put a thermometer back onto the alternator case. And the regulator will watch the temperature of the case, and if it starts getting too high, it will derate the alternator. It'll kind of bring down the power it's putting out until it finds the balance between the airflow and the power. What else could you do? Well, if you have an internally regulated alternator and you don't want to change your gear, you could just put a thermometer on it that you could see, or maybe even have an alarm and you would know to run it differently. I don't really like that idea because I kind of like my electronics to take care of themselves. Or you could modify your alternator and you could add one of these. This is a switch. It's a switch without a handle on it. It's called a thermally activated switch. I'll put a link down below with all the information. I get these on eBay, so their links go away, so don't expect it to stay alive for a long time. But this is what's called a normally closed 10 amp thermal switch. And they come in all different temperatures. This one is 110 degrees Celsius. This will provide continuity, a path for electrons. It's like the switch is on until it gets hot. When it gets hot, it will shut off the flow of electrons. Where to place it? There's every kind of alternator in this world. There are alternators where there's a wire coming in that controls the field. All externally regulated alternators are of that type. If you ran the field through this, and the field didn't require more than 10 amps in this case, and you chose the appropriate sized thermal switch or the appropriate temperature thermal switch, that you have a place on the outside of the case, things get bad, it will switch. This will just get hot, shut off the alternator. Of course, the air is still flowing, it's still spinning, just stops putting out amps. It'll cool down quite quickly. As soon as it cools down, comes back on, and the alternator itself does that dance, on and off, keeping its temperature in check. Now, if you have an alternator like this one, with an internal regulator, there's, again, two types of those. There's some of them where they have to have an outside power source, and it has to stay on all the time. If you disconnect that outside power source, ignition switch, the alternator stops producing power. With that type, again, you could use this externally. Probably for internally regulated alternators, most of them are of a different sort as well. You need that initial power to get them to activate, but once they're activated, they are self-exciting. They will keep making power internally. For those, you have to open the case, and we're going to do that in the next video. The next video I'm going to put out, I'm going to take this alternator and open it up. I'm going to go through the internals of the alternator and teach you how they work. It's good to know because these can fail and they're absolutely field repairable unless something actually fails like diodes, then you need parts. But still, if you know how they work, you're in better shape when you have to take it to a shop, or better yet, you could take the diodes out yourself, go to a shop, say, I need this. They give you some diodes that would fit in the case and you can put them back in yourself. So stay tuned for that video. It's going to be interesting just because, hey, what's going on inside the case? But I'll also show you a way to add this to this so that you can make an alternator that will not overheat. So we now have a way to keep alternators safe when they live in an environment where there's a lithium iron phosphate battery. We can do it thermally with the switch, and we can protect their diodes with a BankManager and keeping lead on. I hope this answers the questions. This is going to be a great tool for me. I hope it's been a good tool for you. When the next person asks me this question, I'm just going to be able to take a link to this video and send it to them. And I'll say, I made a video just for you. And if you have questions about anything that I might know about, boating, electrical, whatever, Patreon's the place to go. You ask a question and I'll answer it there, but you also might spawn my next video for everybody else. Thanks so much for watching, and bye from Temptress.